18 years ago?
18 years, yeah.
Our guest today is Michael Lind. My friend Michael Lind has spent much of his adult life in Washington, D.C., but has recently returned to his native Texas. Michael Lind is the leading living American programmatic thinker in the progressive, productivist, and nationalist tradition of Herbert Croly, and before him of Alexander Hamilton. He is also a master in combining the exploration of class and consciousness with the interpretation of politics in American experience. Many years ago, in the spring of 2001, Michael and I co-taught a course under the same title, American Democracy. And he has agreed to begin today's class with an account of the present situation in the United States, of its historical roots, and of its possible alternative futures. I will not succumb to the temptation of introducing him in the words with which Woodrow Wilson at the Versailles Peace Conference introduced his ever-constant friend and advisor, Colonel House, this highly civilized man from the wilds of Texas.
Thank you, Roberto. Well, thank you. And to put you at ease, I'm going to start by sharing some of my own anxiety, because your professors are two of the public intellectuals I admire the most, and it's a great honor to have my work shared with you and to be invited to speak here. And I know from the class I co-taught with Professor Unger, the high caliber of the student body. So it brings to mind the story about a fellow who drowned in the great Johnstown flood in Pennsylvania in the 19th century. So he goes to heaven, and St. Peter said, well, would you mind giving a talk to God and the angels and the saints about what it was like to be in the Johnstown flood? And so he said, well, sure, I'll talk about it. So he's all ready to talk about it. He gets up in front of the assembled hosts of heaven, and then completely loses it when St. Peter whispers in his ear, remember, Noah's in the audience. But notwithstanding that.
Can you all hear out there, brother?
Can you hear me? Are we turned on here?
We're going to turn on, and we're going to move this up just a little higher, though, brother. We out of Texas, we in Massachusetts, and the relation to this microphone's a little different. Is it on now?
Can you hear me in the back row now? You can hear it?
And
okay.
we want to hear every word. No, go ahead.
All right, and my Texas accent may seep through.
No, that's good. That's good.
Any of you Bostonians may need a translator. Well, I've been asked to structure my talk in epic format, but in lyric poem length. So by epic format, I mean Homer and Virgil began their epics in medias res, in the middle of things, right?
Right.
When
Right.
Odysseus is far from home, when Aeneas is washed up, and then you flash back to the past and then have visions of the future. So I will do all of this, and to spare your attention spans, in a very abbreviated form. So starting with the present, flashing back to the past, and then to the future. In the present, by the present I mean North America and Western Europe, which I'm not going to take on the whole world. The world's very complex. But I do think North America and Western Europe have converged to a degree that could not have been guessed a generation or more ago. Even as recently as the 2000s, people would talk about American exceptionalism. The US has a high fertility rate, high and growing religiosity. This has all changed since I co-taught this course in 2001. The US fertility rate of natives of all races is below replacement. It's similar to that of France and Sweden. It's higher than that of Germany, but it's converging with European norms. The group of nuns, religious nuns, is now tied, I think, with evangelical Protestants and Catholics in terms of their numbers in the U.S. So Europe had been ahead of the U.S. in terms of secularization, but the U.S. is catching up both with secularization and fertility. At the same time, on the other side of the Atlantic, European societies are now multi-ethnic, largely a result of immigration in the last couple of generations from all over the world. So you're getting very similar patterns, and arguably you're getting similar consequences of these social changes. So imagine a map of the US and of Western Europe. Let's leave Eastern Europe out of it, the ex-communist countries. They have their own kind of traditions, but Western Europe and North America. And you've all seen the election maps. The election maps that are most useful are not the state ones, which are somewhat misleading, but it's the county maps. And so if you look at the county maps, you see this pattern where in the US, the blue Democrats are big cities and college towns. It's this kind of archipelago. The Republicans, the red, it's kind of this interstitial space among these big cities and college towns. If you look at the map of Brexit, of the Brexit referendum in the UK, it's very similar. You know, there's the Remainers are concentrated in London, but also some of the bigger cities. Small towns, suburbs voted Leave. Same if you look at France, if you look at Germany, you look at Spain, and so on. So what is going on here? Well, arguably you have this pattern of parallel societies within the same nation state that's fairly similar, whether it's the US, Britain, France, Germany, these other developed countries. One of these is this archipelago of what in my book, The New Class War, and I was flattered to learn that my essay had been assigned. The book will be coming out in October from Penguin. So I call these heartlands and hubs, and the hub cities are kind of have this class structure where you have the college-educated elites, largely native, but a lot of immigrants. You also have an disproportionately foreign-born service class, working for, in many cases, directly for, providing amenities to these affluent professionals and managers in the big cities. So it's kind of an hourglass top and bottom society. Then in these interstitial spaces between the big expensive cities, you have much of the working class, and particularly in the United States, we hear about the white working class all the time. Well, that's true. That's where most of the white working class lives. But since about 10, 20 years ago, a majority of African Americans are suburban and live in the working class. So urban and African American is not necessarily a synonym anymore. A majority of Latinos in the US are suburban. So, you know, when you read things about it's the city versus the country, you really have to think about there's a spectrum from the highly dense areas like just around the Harvard campus. And most people in the Western world now, they do the so-called country or rural, they're not really rural. They're working class people in service sector jobs living in low density neighborhoods in the periphery, which is what the French call it in the surrounding areas, the heartlands. Now, naturally, with this pattern, you get different politics. So I checked this morning to see the data. 37% of the New York population is foreign-born. It's almost the same for London, slightly lower for Paris. It's about 20%. And even the native population of London, Paris, San Francisco, New York, Austin, my hometown, which was a small town when I was born. It's now the 11th largest metro area in the US. Even the natives tend to have moved there from somewhere else. And when you look at the question of mobility, there's a profound class difference in the US and Europe. One of my favorite statistics comes from the New York Times a couple of years ago. The average American lives 18 miles from her mother. And I like to ask people, how many of you live 18 miles from your mother? And in college-educated, professional audiences, the hands never go up. Because those of us who have college degrees and have pursued correction, you move to the opportunity. You pursue your career. You move around the country, you move around the world. The working class in the US, as in Western Europe, is still very geographically rooted. And part of that has to do with expenses. It's expensive if you're making household income as $25,000 a year. It costs thousands of dollars to move across the country. And if you're gonna, maybe janitors are slightly higher paid in California than in Akron, but it costs, it's gonna be wiped out, right, by the cost of moving. The other thing is the professional class can pay for all kinds of childcare services, and in some cases elder care, which falls on the family in working class of all races in the US and Europe. So that's the system we have now, where you have nation states where the big division is not north, south, east, west geographically within the nation state. It's between the bigger cities, the denser cities, and the less dense areas. So how did we get to this pattern? So in the next brief section, I'm only going to talk about the US because it's quite different route in these other countries, and I'm not an expert on it. You flash back, let's say to 1920, 100 years ago, 1919. The United States is not a nation state, quite, in 1919. It is still two countries. There's what the historian Richard Franklin Bensel calls the Republic of the North. This is the Northeast and the Midwest, connected by the Great Lakes and the Erie Canal. And then there's the periphery, or the Republic of the South, because most people lived in the South. The West, then and now, is largely unpopulated, except for a little strip along the Pacific coast. So the South in the early 20th century was the gap between per capita incomes in the North and South in the United States was greater than between Victorian England and Tsarist Russia, the poorest country in Europe. So these were really two countries. Industrialization had already come to the North and the Midwest. In my part of the country, in Texas, until after World War II, people were using kerosene lamps. There were outhouses. There were dirt roads that had not yet been paved. So the brief answer to how did we get from here to there, well, before I get to that, also you had a totally different social structure because the South was an apartheid white supremacist regime, but it was not just racist, it was also a latifundist, right? It was this plantation economy. It was all organized around commodity exports to the Northeast and the Midwest. And we're not going to go all the way back to the Civil War, but the hope of the Southern planter elite during the Civil War was that they could break off from the United States and be incorporated informally into the British Empire as a resource colony, providing cotton for British mills, but also various kinds of food stocks, leather, timber, and they were quite happy with that. They wanted to be the Saudi Arabia of cotton and raw materials. So that's what the South was well into the 20th century. So to overcome this, and nowadays it's often thought that nationalism and liberalism or progressivism are at odds with each other. They were allied in the early 20th century with Herbert Crowley and the Roosevelts, and earlier than that, arguably Frederick Douglass, great American patriot, Abraham Lincoln. The idea was we have to destroy this division and have a single labor market, a single economy, and a single set of civil rights for all citizens. So you had formal civil rights after the Civil War, but thanks to the counter-revolution of the Southern elite during Reconstruction, it had been stripped away. Not only from African Americans in the South, but the white poor. Following something called the Mississippi Plan in the early 1900s, every southern state, including my native southern state of Texas, stripped the vote using property qualifications and poll taxes and things like that from 100% of the African American population in the lower half of the white population. There were two projects. One was to industrialize this agrarian periphery of the industrial Northeast and Midwest. And the other was to extend the rule of law, civil rights, labor market regulations, which should never be thought of except as a pair, right? Because you have to have the rule of law in the labor market as well as the right to vote at the same time. That these two would be extended. And through much turmoil and opportunism and compromise and violence, the New Deal, in its southern context, in Western context, succeeded in raising up the level of industrial modernity through rural electrification, through the highway system, intercontinental highway system, which was a New Deal project, even though it was only realized in the Eisenhower years. So raised up the South and the West, created the so-called Sun Belt in this former depressed rural backwater. The other project was the Civil Rights Revolution, so that Franklin Roosevelt, if he ordered federal authorities and the FBI to investigate, or Harry Truman, some crime in the South, who knew what would happen, right? Maybe they could do it. Maybe they didn't have real power. They had the authority, but not the power. And so with Eisenhower sending U.S. troops to the South for the first time since the Civil War, we started moving towards this. So how does this get to where we are now? Well, I would argue that this process of nationalization of the United States, this has been a good thing. This has been great, right? We're no longer two countries like some kind of medieval empire where there are different regimes and you cross a border and, who knows whether the king's, power extends. So it is a nationalized system. The tragedy is, and in civil rights as well, there's a single uniform power and authority throughout the United States, in the sense that there wasn't even as recently as the 1960s. So where we have failed, and I think this is true of Europe as well, and it's what you've been talking about in this class with neoliberalism, is what the economist called countervailing, the economist John Kenneth Galbraith called countervailing power. That is the organized power of the working class majority of all races, who, if you use high school versus college as a quick and dirty index of class, it's about 70% of the population. For minorities like African Americans and Latinos, it's even more. It's higher. There are fewer college graduates. So the institutions which once represented these folks, and the two most important in the middle of the 20th century were trade unions, which the 21st century left likes, and churches, which played a major role, particularly the African American community, civil rights movement, and which the contemporary progressives aren't as fond of necessarily as contemporary conservatives. But these were mass membership organizations, and they could force the national elite, state and local and national elites, to meet with them and listen to their concerns and amend their decisions and share power. Not necessarily in ways that modern enlightened progressives would agree with. So for example, the Catholic Legion of Decency was the most powerful force in the US media between the 1930s and the 1970s and 80s. They were so strong, and these were federations of Catholic social conservatives and some Protestants, that Hollywood studios submitted scripts to them for their approval, right? And this explains why there's some of these anomalies For example, under the rules of the day, even married couples had to be shown sleeping in separate beds, right? So make sure no hanky-panking is going on even among married people.
The Dick Van Dyke Show.
And if you're a fan of old 1950s sword and sandal epics, as I am, you know, the Ten Commandments and stuff, you could not show male nipples, right? This would set the audience into a frenzy of lust. So Charlton Heston's belt comes up to his neck almost, right? So it's not necessarily that this was a liberal or left-wing thing, but they had real power. I mean, they represented constituents, and so did the trade unions. What has happened, and you know, here I'll wrap this up quickly, as we know, was the trade unions have collapsed from about a third of the American workforce to, in the private sector, it's less than 6% now. They survive more in the public sector, but all but extinct in the private sector. And this is often blamed on globalization, but actually globalization, starting in the 80s and 90s, came after the unions had been crippled. And they had been crippled by the fact, and here again we have the two-country legacy, that southern states are right-to-work states. That is, you can't have compulsory union membership. And the federal law that emerged in the late 30s permitted this. So companies just closed down their factories in the states with strong unions and moved them to southern states. So this came even before the wave of offshoring to Mexico and to China and other countries. And the decline of religious congregations as social institutions has created what the French sociologist Emile Durkheim called anomie, this kind of alienation. And we see this now, so I'll just wrap up by going back to the picture of the heartlands and the hubs. If you're a college-educated and a professional living in a big city, in like New York or Boston or London or Paris, you are more likely to have an arch-traditional family life, to be married, to have kids, to have property, to have a single-family home, all of these things. The rates of cohabitation without wedlock, I'm not being judgmental here, I'm just being analytical. And the working class of all races, this transracial thing, the low-income, high school educated people, drug abuse, dropping out of the workforce, and this cuts across race and ethnicity. It's a class thing. These are all on the rise in the United States and in Western Europe. And just to conclude, I think this is why you have Donald Trump in the White House, why you have Brexit, why you have the Gilets jaunes, the yellow jackets in Paris. That is, instead of having these intermediate institutions, and we're not talking about clubs, right? This is not Robert Putnam's bowling clubs and things like that. We're talking about power-sharing institutions,
Very
right?
important distinction.
So they're restraining economic and political elites. It's not just socializing with your friends. Without those institutions, with constant negotiation between these petty power brokers, I call them petty tribunes, and use the Roman language in my book. Without that, it's kind of like an old-fashioned steam engine. The pressure just builds up and builds up and builds up. Then there's an explosion because you're not letting off steam through lots of little valves here and there. And so on that was, how many minutes was that? That was the briefest epic in history.
Michael, before you stop, develop more the programmatic implications.
Oh, the future, I left out the future. Yeah, the future. Well, I think that in terms of what I would like to see and what I expect to see are two different things. What I would like to see is something like the New Deal civil rights era project in the US and in similar countries, but in the circumstances of the time. So it's completely different economic and social circumstances. Now that you have an aging population, it's multi-ethnic in a way that it was not in these monocultural nation states of the West with overwhelming majorities. half a century or more ago. I think in my book, I do not conclude with a list of policies to be adopted because I've become very skeptical about this at this point. And it just goes back to my analysis. A few years ago, a well-known billionaire whom I won't name, it was not the president, invited me to meet with some other billionaires and professors and experts in a castle outside of London to help devise a new, more inclusive capitalism. So he's a nice guy. He's a nice guy. Unfortunately, they didn't offer to pay my travel expenses.
Oh my God.
So I thought about sending an email. I'd love to join you, but my private jet is in the shop. It's like there's something wrong with the muffler. They're looking into this. So I just, it's not going to be out in time. But after 30 years in Washington in government and journalism, nonprofit sector, I don't think you can fix anomie. You cannot fix the Durkheimian problem by having a committee of smart people in DC decide what we're going to give those folks, right? What they need is power, right? And if you give them power, and they are lots of different people power, not one person, not one great, I have a piece coming out in a national newspaper in the next week or two, where I say, if you look at, and I'm picking on the Democrats simply because that primary is open. But we've now got to the point that everyone thinks, who is this superhuman candidate who is going to save us? And every candidate has to have his or her entirely new ideas and new programs and all this. No, we don't get out of this except very gradually by having institutions where at the industrial sectors are negotiating with lots and lots of labor representatives, where you have commissions overseeing the media, where underrepresented minorities, which can be religious as well as racial and ethnic and sexual, say, well, we're tired of being left out of Hollywood and media presentations. So you have all this negotiation going on constantly. So that's one half of it. So it's a structural reform, right? And the other half is some kind of mobilization, some kind of national project, because the very nature of collaboration is you are collaborating in service of a goal, right? You're not just doing it to shoot the breeze and get to know each other, you're working on a team. The Whig economist Henry Carey, an advisor of President Lincoln, coined the phrase the harmony of interests between labor and capital. And ordinarily you have a disharmony. It's just capital's trying to beat the hell out of labor and labor's trying to fight back. But if you have a common project, the way the industrialization of the South and West was in the New Deal and the civil rights movement, the World War II, World War I, the Cold War, as Randolph Burns said, war is the health of the state. And it's very tragic, but the most effective way for the state to step in and say, okay, labor, capital, Protestants, Catholics, blacks, whites, it's just, you guys got to work together, right? Because of this common external threat. So those are the two things I think. You need the intermediate institutions, and you need the common project that will justify their collaboration of different classes. And one final thought, and this will be controversial in the book. So I criticize the idea of meritocracy. Some of you may know that Michael Young, the British sociologist, he coined the term meritocracy in a novel, which was a satire. He's making fun of the idea that countries should be run by people like many of us who did well on tests, right? What a horrible society. And particularly in the last generation, and I see this, I'm old enough to remember the last years of the New Deal era. It's quite different system in the US. But the last generation, conservatives, liberals, centrists, it's all about helping the one individual get out of the working class and join the professional class, right? So everyone should have the chance to go to a great university like Harvard and get a great job and all of this. The class systems in the US and Europe are much more open than they were in the past. It's still largely hereditary. If you go to college in the US or Europe, you are almost certainly the child of people who went to college, right? There's some people who are coming up from less advantaged backgrounds, but that's still the case. So by all means, you know, make things more meritocratic. But you know, it's like the talented 10th. There's the other 90%, right? And we need to go back to, there was a moment after World War II when the vision of the New Deal was your life will get better if you're a member of the working class, and you don't have to cease being working class. If you're an electrician or if you're a maid, you can join a union, you'll get benefits. Thanks to technology, that's why there was this productivist technological innovation element was central to the vision of these projects in the middle of the 20th century in the US and Europe. You know, you will get a black and white TV first, then you'll get a color TV, then every room will have a TV, right? So the appliances will get better, your benefits will get better. Over time, they expected that productivity would result in more leisure, right? So that, you know, they expected in the 1940s, by the year 2019, people would be working 3 or 4 days a week, right? But that was a vision in which it wasn't the rising tide lifts all boats, but it was that the job of the elite was not to bring in a few more people to join the elite. It was to make life better for the non-elite. And they didn't do so out of the goodness of their hearts, necessarily. There's some of them did. They did so because the non-elite, they had their own organizations and they could hold them accountable. Thanks.
Absolutely. So rich indeed. And just let's give it up for our brother. No, Roberto said that this is the one case where we've allowed him to give us his overarching, very fascinating and
now the interrogation.
And the question begins. But I want to make a meta point, though, because I think it's very important for just teaching purposes, that what sets Brother Michael aside from so many other intellectuals is that he has a synthetic analysis that's able to keep track of the ways in which the parts of the whole are interdependent and interrelated. So it flies in the face of the kind of narrow specialization that goes hand in hand with the formation of the professional managerial classes in places like Harvard, a site of ruling class formation in the empire. The thinking that goes into it, it connects the parts, and it's synecdochic. And the synecdoche, we know, is a rhetorical trope. It has to do, what is the relation of the part to the whole? So he's not just polishing the small parts of the nuts and not giving us a conception of the forest. But he gives us a conception of the forest. That's what intellectuals do, provide dramatic stories and narratives. And drama is always conflict, critically reflected upon, but also emotionally felt. And if you had a chance to read his narrative poem on the Alamo, or his novel on the Power Town in Washington, D.C., and you got a collection of poems coming out, this sense of soulcraft that we've been talking about, its connection between that synthetic analysis, this synecdochic imagination, and then a synoptic vision. What does the American civilization, American empire, actually look like given these class transformations, and his focus on the oligarchs? Going back to James Burnham's text of 1941, The Managerial Revolution, who was also one of the grand intellectuals. He made his move from left to right. And this is just a meta comment, as he's an example of how one thinks about American democracy with a sense of history. What does it mean to be attuned to operations of power, class, race? We can talk more about gender and sexual orientation and so forth, and empire. And so I just want to start with that meta comment, even before we dive in. And this was one of the reasons why it's so very good to have him provide both the essay as well as as well as the presentation. Brother Roberto, you want
No,
to just...
go. Begin, please.
Well, I didn't really have a question. That was a compliment.
Well, it brought to mind, Professor Unger and Professor West asked me earlier what had influenced me in my intellectual
Yes.
formation. The obscure German philosopher Wilhelm Dilthey, the idea that you have the human sciences and the physical sciences.
The Geist des Wissenschaften.
Exactly. And the essence of the human sciences, if the physical sciences, ultimately it's mathematics and physics, is the meta-discipline, and then physics is the meta-discipline for chemistry, which is the meta-discipline for biology and so on. Ultimately, it's psychology is the basis of the human sciences, and something he called Verstehen, means empathy or insight. It doesn't mean you have to like the person. This can be your archenemy. It can be the rival soldier. But you have to learn how this individual thinks and see the world through his or her eyes. And this is what draws me to fiction and poetry as well as to politics.
So, Michael, let me press you on the last episodes in your narrative. How do you see in this context the failure, the defeat of the neoliberal post-progressive consensus in American politics and the rise of this so-called plutocratic populism in the sequel? What is the meaning of this? And what are the transformative opportunities that it presents to the country?
Well, I think first the meaning, the structure of politics in the Western world, and I think it's true on both sides of the Atlantic, has shifted from left versus right to insiders versus outsiders. And this is something, and Professor West mentioned oligarchy. In the American South, this was a very oligarchic society. Politics there was essentially run by factions, right? It doesn't necessarily by parties or movements. It's often they're very personal factions around particular individuals and particular groups. And they kind of run things most of the time. If the majority of the population is sufficiently alienated, they often rally behind demagogues. And my part of the country specialized in the Southern demagogue. So figures like Trump are fairly rare in the Northeast, although you did have the most important politician in Boston of the 20th century. It wasn't John Fitzgerald Kennedy. It was Mayor Michael Curley, who was the dominant figure from the 20s to the 50s. I believe he was reelected at one point from prison. He's governor of Massachusetts for one unsuccessful term. So these demagogues, by its nature, demagogic populism cannot answer this need, right? Because it can't answer the need for day-to-day, ordinary, institutionalized representation of ordinary people, right? You know, the demagogue pretends to represent all of the people, right, and have this mystical sense of connection. But even if it's the most benevolent demagogue, it's impossible by the nature of things. So the danger is that...
But for two distinct reasons that are connected, right? One is that the demagogic populist is an extra institutional Caesarist,
Right.
an agitator who leaves no institutional legacy.
That's right.
And no form of collective action.
Yeah.
But the second reason is that the antidotes that he supplies, the provision of the popular needs, also has no structural content. It doesn't.
It's symbolic.
It's symbolic. It has no productive result.
Right.
And so this is ephemeral. But the fact that it's ephemeral suggests there would be an opportunity for a real alternative if the real alternative were presented. So it's that story that I want to understand better. So there's the consensus, the post-New Deal, pseudo-progressive, neoliberal consensus. It fails. Why does it fail? Then there's this populist sequel, which is like a false solution. And that would then lead to the third episode, which is a more real alternative. That's what's missing. And that's what you began to design in the final part of your remarks.
To do that in the 3 stages you mentioned.
Yes.
So why does neoliberalism fail? Neoliberalism, and I know the Clintons, I mean, I was there in the 90s when they were promoting this. It was this great new shiny vision. It was that the jobs of the future, it was ultimately economic, either automation or offshoring would eliminate these traditional working class unionized jobs, but the whole population would move up with the appropriate human capital in the jobs of the future. It's all software coding, it's tech jobs, it's things like that. That it seemed plausible. Much of the elite believes it to this day. I mean, education reform, people say the answer is education, more STEM skills. I lost my faith in this when I looked at the Bureau of Labor Statistics. It has 10-year projections for the number of jobs being created in the US. And I followed this for 20 years now. And they periodically update it, but it's pretty much the same pattern. At no point in the last 20 years have the top 10 jobs being created in the United States in sheer numbers, absolute numbers of jobs, required more than a high school education. With 2 exceptions, registered nurses and general managers at Safeway or something like that. They tend to have BAs or registered nurses, have some specialized training. All the other jobs being created in the US, and this is true in Western Europe too, the vast majority of the most numerous jobs do not require STEM skills. They do not require higher education. They require a few weeks of on-the-job training. Increasingly, they are in healthcare, and they are poorly paid healthcare jobs like health aid. Retail clerks in retail stores, distribution centers, security guards, janitors, waiters and waitresses are big. Now, as an old-fashioned New Dealer, I have no problem with these being jobs. This is fine. They're perfectly acceptable if they paid well and had good benefits and political clout. Mm-hmm. But the neoliberal story is that somehow these were going to wither away. So I think that was the fundamental, because people kept waiting. Okay, right? Where are all these tech jobs? And there are a substantial number of them, but as a percentage of jobs in the economy, it's just a few percent compared to the ones that do not require college education. So if you hear people say to have your children will need to study STEM skills and engineering in order to be software coders and so on, you should just laugh, right? If that's the population as a whole. I mean, obviously there are coders and engineers and so on, but that was a myth. And so when it became clear that after waiting and waiting and waiting for these knowledge economy jobs to appear, and we're all moving up in this mass upper middle class, and it wasn't going to happen, I think I'm surprised it took so long. I mean, you had sort of a backlash even with Ross Perot in the 1990s. But then you had the booming economy, which was a result of Silicon Valley innovation. It wasn't a result of government policy. And that crashed in 2001. Then we get another boom as a result of Federal Reserve policy, and that crashes in 2008. So really a few years into the Great Recession, which is really a global depression, at that point, the thing finally snaps, right? 2015, 2016. And that's when the public just, in my view, just says, okay, we're not going to wait any longer, right? They've been telling us, just be patient, go to, study STEM skills, all of this stuff. And you get these outbursts. So that brings us to the populists. And there's an element of charlatanism to it. Because, I was thinking about this morning when I tell the class. Everything that demagogic populists say is not necessarily false or wicked. So think about it. If you're a demagogue, that's Greek for leader of the demos, of the people, you would be an unemployed demagogue if you're telling crowds unpopular things, right? So the successful demagogues, they're going to tell them something that's popular. They'll often say something that's true, right? An actual analysis. of the problem. But as Professor Unger says, the proposal, instead of having a long-term program, you tend to have iconic images or symbols. So for William Jennings Bryan, four-time candidate for the president, agrarian populist, late 19th century, there was a global agricultural depression that affected the United States, for half a century, around 1900. It was eventually dealt with, we'll go to that in a minute, by programmatic means. But so he had a simple solution. It was free silver. It was bimetallism. That is, the dollar was backed by gold. It was hard money. Many of the farmers had debts to Eastern bankers, particularly in the Midwest and in the South, had mortgages they had to repay to bankers who were located in New York City and the East Coast. So it was really about inflating the currency. If you added silver, which was being produced and mined in great quantities to the currency, then you're essentially having inflation. So you're paying back the wicked New York bankers in ever more worthless currencies. Good for a farmer, it's like bad for the bankers, right? They like hard currency, gold standard. But the problem was it became a fetish. So free silver, there's actually a free silver party, right? So flash forward to today.
And that continues today, right? Because now cheap money in the United States is the residual strategy of economic growth and the alternative to structural change.
Yeah, that's right.
Delegated by the federal government to the central bank.
So you flash forward to Donald Trump, who in many ways, he's not Hitler or Mussolini, he's like William Jennings Bryan or Huey Long, these classic demagogues.
But more a know-nothing version.
Yeah.
Just want to be precise.
No nativist in the know-nothing sense.
That's right.
But so, look, the United States has real immigration crises, right? I mean, people coming up, sometimes with children not their own, applying for asylum at the border when they're actually economic migrants. You have 10 or 11 or 12 million unauthorized immigrants, right? Working in the They're real problems.
Right.
It is essentially a system that benefits employers of immigrants, not necessarily working class people who don't have nannies and they pay taxes for the public schools, right? And that have immigrant kids in them. So they're like real fraught issues here, but they're genuine issues. So what does Trump do? He comes up with the symbol. So the symbol is the wall, right? Comprehensive immigration reform, which has failed twice in the US Congress in 2007, then again 2014. It's hard for people to remember. I can't even remember all the moving parts, right? There's like a path to citizenship, and there's enforcement, and there's amnesty, and there's all these. And now that actually is a sensible programmatic way to approach it, okay? But it's just complicated. So he has this big, beautiful wall, right? And he's a marketing genius because instead of saying fencing, which we already have partially along the border, and Senator Obama and Senator Clinton voted to extend the fencing in 2006, I think it was. He said a wall, because a wall is more of an image, right, than like a see-through fence or something. And so Huey Long, the populist governor of Louisiana in the 1930s and one of the great American demagogues, his re-election slogan was "Every man a king," right? And his one programmatic proposal, he did some good stuff in hospitals and free college tuition, things like that. But his one slogan was, he's actually a bit like Bernie Sanders, tax on the millionaires, right? So that was his panacea, that was his trademark. So this is a dead end. You have, the neoliberals cannot provide what they said they would provide, which is rising living standards in dignity and power for the majority of people who are not college educated. The demagogue comes along and says, oh, here, I've got free silver, the wall, right? And because he or she channels their anger, they're willing to give these demagogues a certain leeway in terms of fact, right? But it's a great show, but when the show is over and the circus has left town, the oligarchs are still running everything. And the demagogue, unless he or she has founded a personal dynasty or sold out to the establishment, is forgotten. And so what you need is a program, but it's also you need an army, right? I mean, it's not a program that a few intellectuals devise and impose. You have to have groups which they don't have to come from the working class entirely. They can be members of the social elite, but they have to be accountable to working class people. So I've been in the NGO world for the last 20 years or so. And NGO world does some good things, does some bad things. But if you're an NGO, non-government organization, nonprofit, you're accountable to program officers at foundations or to rich individuals, right? So you may be doing good work, but you're doing the good to people.
Absolutely.
You're not doing good with people.
Absolutely.
Right? You're not meeting on a weekly basis with the people. So you will get a benevolent billionaire, I know a few, and they will give you money and say, well, like, let's solve the housing problem. And so then you come up with, your 10-point plan for solving the housing problem without actually talking to people who lack housing.
And who are going to live in it?
They're going to live in it. Yeah.
Exactly. I know we're going to open it up, but one quick point. And this relates to healthy versions of left populism, because your preoccupation with oligarchs, hand in hand with your focus on power, puts a premium on power sharing. So we're talking about richer, deeper conceptions of citizenship that provide richer and deeper conceptions of public life. So the participant is one thing, recipient is something else.
That's right.
See, there was a major shift that took place in the 60s when many of us were fighting for full employment. You remember the old Hawkins bill?
The freedom budget.
And the freedom budget, coming out of freedom budget. And that's very different than welfare.
Yeah.
The welfare, you're a recipient. Full employment means everyone has access to a job at a living wage, and therefore you are a participant, and you don't have to worry about being a recipient, and therefore it's a very different orientation. You get the paternalism of elites when it comes to welfare. Full employment is the expansion of democratic citizenship, power sharing in that way. What are the prospects? I'm going to be spending the next 2 days with my dear brother Bernie Sanders, and I'm going to tell him what you said. What are the prospects of a left populism in this decadent moment of the American empire?
Well, I think the obstacles to it
Yes.
are, we've seen the enormous advances in my lifetime with women's rights, with gay rights,
Absolutely.
following the model of the African American civil rights revolution. But the rights language, appropriate when you're getting rid of apartheid and homophobia and all of that, it's not a collaborative language, right? And I think the point that needs to get out there, and particularly because the elites, both the center right and the center left, want to segment people and have narrow casting for different constituencies. So you need an inclusive language. And you also need to make the point, which I've become kind of obsessed with, is if you're a working class person, you do not have the resources of college-educated managers and professionals. You don't have professional contacts, school contacts. You don't know how to write letters to the editor. You don't know how to all this. The only thing the working class has is its numbers. And the only way to turn that resource of numbers into power is organization and teamwork, right? A good friend of mine, Ernesto Cortes. Do you know Ernesto Cortes?
Yes, indeed. IAF.
IAF, and great Latino organizer in Texas and California.
The Saul Alinsky legacy.
Yeah, and so I had him come speak to the students who, at the LBJ school, who were mostly, I already got a friend to invite him to talk. They're from my class. I mean, they're upper middle class, and they're educated, and they, very well-meaning. And so he said, well, what should I talk about? And I said, well, tell them they have to work with their enemies on common projects. And I knew Ernie could address this because he has a brilliant phrase I love to quote. He says, politics is the art of getting some people to do the right thing for the right reason, and it's also getting them to do the right thing for the wrong reason, okay? And the wrong reason may be their reason. It's not your reason. And there's a actual new school of political science studying what's called transpartisanship. And you see this, for example, the Reverend Jesse Jackson and the Reverend Jerry Falwell, remember? They collaborated in Appalachia on programs. You get people from totally different perspectives, and they're never going to agree.
Criminal justice right
Criminal justice is probably the central transpartisan.
now. Koch brothers and
Yeah.
So, Michael,
Michelle,
before we open it up, I want to press you on the economic and productivist element of your argument. Because when you were explaining the failure of the neoliberal consensus, you said the neoliberal consensus promised that there would be this spontaneous expansion of the STEM workers, the knowledge economy, and that gradually the majority would be absorbed in it, and it didn't happen. Nevertheless, it seems that in that neoliberal illusion, there is a perverted element of truth. There's something that has to be rescued. And that becomes clear if we compare that view, that false view, to the alternative to it. The alternative to it is what has prevailed afterwards, namely that all the political forces can do is buy a few more years for declining mass production through protection, through subsidies, through constraints of different kinds. It's the Rust Belt. It has no future. It can't come back. So that story must also be false. And the productivist element in the alternative would require you to have a view of the reconstruction of the knowledge economy. It's not just education. It requires a different set of institutional arrangements so that a broader part of the periphery of the economy can have access to advanced productive resources and opportunities. It is, in other words, a structural transformation, which neither the neoliberals nor the populist sequel have provided or even promised.
That's absolutely right. And I'm glad you brought that up because the third or fourth or fifth industrial revolution, whatever you want to call it,
Yes.
the ICT revolution, information technology, which people like Clinton, Gore, others put so much hope in, rightly so, in the 1980s and 1990s. And they saw themselves, the early neoliberals were right about a lot of things, right? They said the industries of the future are not mass production automobiles using electromechanical technology from the 1920s at a high degree of refinement, right? We're on the wave of this revolutionary advance. The revolutionary advance came, but it stalled in a small sector of the economy, leaving whole sectors.
That's what Berto was
These insular vanguards controlled by a small cast of mega firms.
Yeah, and so what should have happened, I think, in 2000 when there was this big Silicon bubble crash was at that point the second stage of the information revolution should have been going to backward, primitive, labor-intensive things like fast food, right, like hotels, all of these things which could have been upgraded so that you have fewer workers in some cases, but they can share the productivity growth, right, and have fewer hours and better benefits and higher wages. And there's no problem with technological unemployment. Ever since the Industrial Revolution began, there's been temporary displacement of workers in particular sectors. The only time you get mass unemployment in the industrial economy is when you have financial panics, like the Great Recession, and particularly financial panics that spread into mortgages and affect everybody. But so the whole robots are going to lead to unemployment thing, I think, is a myth. So what happens in Silicon Valley, 2001, 2002? Everybody goes into apps, right? So I knew an individual from the journalism world who quit, one of my editors, and was going to go become a tech entrepreneur. So I thought, oh, that's really interesting, so what are you going to do? Well, it turns out this family of rich investors had decided that they could create a website and get people to upload cute videos of their pets for free, and then they would become rich by selling the advertising, right, to companies. So I'm not kidding. Much of the brain power of the U.S. and the globe, you had Peter Thiel here, right?
Yeah,
He's got this famous lines like, "Where's my flying car? Where's my robot?" Right? We've had all of this brain power trying to come up with a cute pet video app for your phone, right, for 10 or 15 years. Meanwhile,
most of the economy continues to
it's like
sink
the
into
1950s.
primitive production.
Yeah, it's like, it's not different, whether it's cleaning or retail and because these are primitive labor-intensive jobs, that's where the job creation is, as people are shoved out of the productive sector. So I think the project, I agree absolutely, and Professor Unger's book, The Knowledge Economy, is very good about this. We need to, but I've tried this at several institutions, and I get resistance. Because if you say, for example, construction in the United States is an incredibly primitive business. We basically build houses the way they built medieval ships. You put down this wooden frame and you hammer things on it. And so we don't build them like cars or planes, right? And there's now rapid prototyping technology that has built houses, right? But this is where you have to have a project, because if you're a realtor or a developer, right, you're just going to hire poor people to hammer together houses out of wood sticks. Why would you change, right? Particularly if it's a low-profit business. You have no money for R&D, right? You're not going to risk changing your business model. Medicine, hospitals, right? I mean, when you go to the doctor and you fill out paper forms, and it's incredibly backward and labor-intensive. I'm glad you raised that point, because, and I think this is the problem with the progressives now. They don't think about the technological innovation the way that Franklin Roosevelt and the Kennedys and, I think the Freedom Budget authors and the Civil Rights Movement did.
Well, on the whole, they have no productivist project, period.
Yeah,
they have no project for the supply side of the economy.
It's about redistributing the money.
It's about the demand side, the consumption side.
Yeah. I think that's right.
Yeah.
Questions, queries? We can start in the back. Don't hesitate. Don't hesitate. Yes. Yes. Mm-hmm.
I don't think you will get the 1950s United Auto Workers, Steel Workers type adversarial unions, where that only worked with mid-20th century technology, where you had these enormous factories in Detroit, right, or mines, and a strike could shut down all production in the country, and so the employers, would hammer out a multi-year deal, and I think in the knowledge economy, the information economy, most of the jobs are going to be in the non-traded domestic service sector. A lot of them will be in healthcare, and that's perfectly fine as the cost of living get cheaper and TVs and iPhones and so on get cheaper, people can spend more on health, and the other is recreation. That's fine too. So, but those tend to be, they don't have economies of scale, even if they're helped by technology, by using the internet to advertise yourself as a self-employed, massage therapist for the elderly or something. So it's not like Detroit with whole armies of workers, and it's a real challenge to labor organization. Now, there have always been sectors like this. In Britain in the early 20th century, they were called the sweated trades. these were things like sectors like seamstresses who would do piecework out of their cottages in the British Isles. And you couldn't organize them. And they had no leverage against the employers because if they pushed back, they just didn't, their contract was cut off, right? And they couldn't bring the whole industry to a halt the way the steel workers or the auto workers could. So Winston Churchill, as a liberal, he was a conservative, then a liberal, then a conservative, around before World War I, supported the British innovation of wage boards. And these are government brokered institutions where representatives of the workers sit on a commission with representatives of employers and the government as a moderator. And they set wages and standards in a kind of non-adversarial. So you flash forward to a few years ago, Governor Andrew Cuomo of New York, rather than simply have a bill to improve the wages and conditions of fast food workers in the state of New York, they revived, I think it's brilliant, they revived this old 1930s wage board law from the New Deal. And he convened a wage board for the fast food industry and had representatives of labor, you should tell Bernie about this.
I will.
A lot of states have these laws, they simply haven't been used for 50 or 60 years. And then you set it for that sector, and you're involving and negotiating with people. And now I'm for a high minimum wage, but look, there are cost of living differences in different parts of the country, and sectors have different. Often the labor unions, as you may know, have opposed one-size-fits-all national policies because they're afraid that the floor will also be a ceiling.
Yeah, exactly.
And they won't be able to negotiate. Exactly. So I think, and there are other ideas about works councils. Works councils are company-organized equivalents of unions within companies. Now, the AFL-CIO historically opposed this, and they're actually illegal under 1930s law as company unions. They were seen as fake unions. But some people have argued that this is a form of alt-labor, as it's called, that we can take another look at in the 21st century. So I think your generation has great opportunity, to rethink institutions outside. And as important as political reform is, I think that if ordinary people, their only act of agency is casting a ballot in a majority, in an uncompetitive election in a territorial district every few years, and then when they spend most of their days in the workplace where it's a total tyranny, right? It's complete despotism. And then and the media too. I'm kind of soft on I think if the image that people have of their society is set by a small number of commercial enterprises, in a few cities, well, they have no say in that, of how their group is portrayed, how they're portrayed, So political electoral democracy is central, but it needs to be supplemented by, and it doesn't have to be democracy in the sense of one person, one vote, but some kind of representation.
Because I'm just thinking, the role of social media
Yeah.
that often fills the vacuum as the churches, mosques, synagogues, and others, much more basis of right-wing articulation than progressive articulation. But the role
also
of social
class.
media and the culture of celebrity and the obsession with
Yeah, but it's also a class thing. So there are lots of studies now that show that the college-educated are much more involved with social media than the working class is, which kind of stands to reason. If you're driving a FedEx truck, you're not like, trolling people on blogs, right? You have a certain amount of leisure at the office.
But I was this sister showed me this new Beyonce, the new Beyonce documentary. What's it called? Homecoming.
Well, tell them about it. You're a celebrity,
Well,
more
no,
of a celebrity.
She was kind of have some words of mine, but the point is this: that her social base goes far beyond the elites,
well, that's
far beyond the middle classes. You got a whole lot of precious poor and working class folk of all colors around the world who's tied into Beyonce's genius. So is that a fair characterization?
Yeah, if you look at, if you look at the modern demagogues like Trump, they are either self-funded like Ross Perot,
Oh, right.
or they're media celebrities. Trump combines the two.
Right. With the
Right.
penance and.
But I think there's room for Oprah to run against Kid Rock in the 2020s or 2030s. So,
Wow. Boy, that's a moment for cognac, isn't it? Well, there's another hand. Yes, go right ahead. Go right ahead.
okay. It's happened before.
Louder, louder.
If we increase the number of nodes between different actors and equal power, somehow that'll create a better outcome. Could you talk more about the causal logic of how we actually get that better outcome? Because it's sort of the way you framed it sounds, well, if we devolve and we increase the number of conversations going on, it'll improve. I'm not sure actually how that happens.
Well, I do think it's in the context of economic development, technological development.
But this is a crucial point,
Yeah.
that I think there has to be the connection between the multiplication of these forms of collective action, that's the process element, with the productivist content, because the process by itself is not enough.
Yeah, but the process is important because in an industrial capitalist society, and you have a mix of government R&D and venture capital driving innovation, much of the innovation has been driven by the desire of people to get rich quick in IPOs at the age of 30, right, with the cat video app, right? And they're investors. If it involved, there's a demand side to it as well. The demand of ordinary working class people is represented. They would tell you things like, why can't I have a technological health portal so that I don't have to sign all of these papers every time I go to the doctor for my diabetes, and the nurse will kill me by assigning the wrong drug because the doctors don't communicate to each other. Things which, if you're the venture capitalist in the hot tub in San Francisco, you know, like hearing a pitch, you know, then I really think that if ordinary people had a voice, there would be all kinds of things that would make their lives technological products, right? And communications devices, you know. So we can't afford childcare, so we have to have, you know, my great aunt look after the toddler. You know, can we have some sort of device to monitor this? I'm just inventing these off the top of my head, but I don't think that's what your top Silicon Valley investors are thinking in terms of what is needed. And it's also something which, it's why you need these conversations in the private sector, right? Because it's having a congressional subcommittee do this, it's just, you know, I don't think it's going to be effective. So I think part of the agency is there's a demands out there for products and technologies which the actual technological innovators are not aware of because they don't know about the lifestyles of people. Yeah.
I mean, there are apps that automate human work that Uber's sort of, you know, done that in transportation. That then has the knock-on effect of disemploying a ton of people, right? So if you're optimizing around the product and the demand side, you're still not solving the people who those products are designed for in another form.
Well, as I said earlier, I do not believe in the possibility of long-term mass technological unemployment. There's something called Wagner's Law. It was named after Adolf Wagner, a German economist, early 20th century. So he showed that as technology, even then, 1900, was advancing, in 1800 you spent almost all of your income on food and fuel and clothing and shelter, right? By 1900 that was going down because of the Industrial Revolution. And they do these charts sometimes in the Atlantic and other magazines, like what families spent in 1950 and so on. Even a working class family spends much less now on their electronic devices and on food is cheap and clothing is cheap. And part of it is offshoring, but mostly it's innovation, technological productivity. So let's say that no working class people get a raise for 100 years, okay? And their inflation adjusted income is exactly the same in 2100 as it is in 2000. But all this other stuff, including heart operations and brain transplants and everything is cheaper, that frees up discretionary income from their frozen salary. Now, what do people spend discretionary income on? Well, we know by looking at rich people. They spend it on quality of life, amenities, services, and experiences, right? So once they have 7 houses and 12 yachts and private plane, they stop buying things, right? And we see that with first world populations, right? As the necessities get less expensive because of productivity, ordinary people go on vacations. Couldn't do this 50, 100 years ago. Americans, unhealthy as it may be, now eat out more than they eat at home. That was, when I was a kid, like McDonald's was the big, right?
That was a high moment.
That was a high moment of the week.
High moment.
It was.
Those fries, oh my God.
So you can tell a story in which, and it's also an environmentally friendly story, in the sense that when people say, if everyone lived like an American now, it would overwhelm resources and the climate and all of this. But, it looks as though as industrial civilization progresses, that material consumption will plateau at a certain level. And then what you're spending money on is largely leisure and hospitality. And the other big one is healthcare. An economist who passed away a few years ago, Robert Vogel, shocked his colleagues by saying that even if we controlled unnecessary health prices in the US, the health sector would probably be 30% or 40% of the economy by the end of the century. And that's perfectly fine, because healthcare, I think the economics term is a perfect good. It's a good that makes other goods possible, so that you can't enjoy any of the other things you want to do with your money if you're sick, right? So that's why rich people, the richer you get, the bigger the share of your income you spend on healthcare. So because people don't understand this, and this gets to your nostalgia point, Roberto. They said, well, the good jobs were working on automobiles parts factories, right? And nursing is a bad job. And the fact that we're getting more and more healthcare jobs means that this is a terrible thing, it must be reversed. We have to get more manufacturing jobs. In an advanced industrial society, you would expect almost all of the job creation to be in the sectors where we see it now. Healthcare, leisure, hospitality, right? That's not a bad thing, that's a good thing. It means that robots are doing other stuff, right? And you're freeing human beings to do these person-to-person services, including waiters and health aides. And the reason these are considered bad jobs is because of the conditions of payment. It's because of the cultural associations and the stigma. But you can change those, right? And so I think it's more important to say there's nothing wrong with all these jobs being created. They need to pay well. Yeah. People need to have benefits. They need to have some kind of collective bargaining power. And these will be the middle-class jobs of the future. The home health aide will be the typical middle-class person of 2100.
So this is just to define this point. So in the middle of the occupation structure, which is supposedly being hollowed out, there are these figures that have been called by one economist the new artisan. So it's technologically equipped problem solving combined with interaction among people. And the registered nurse is actually a characteristic example. But so are a series of the higher trades, like plumber and electrician, that are now increasingly performed in a different way. And that's a model of how the qualitative character of peripheral production is lifted up
Yeah.
and comes closer to the knowledge economy.
Yeah, there's been a project to upgrade nurse practitioners in the United States for 30 or 40 years. That is, these are registered nurses. You allow them to do a lot of things that doctors only are allowed to do with their MDs. And the nurses know how to do it, and they can do it. I mean, they watch all of this. But so here you get, it's a war between the higher guilds and the lower guilds, right? Because the Harvard MD does not want to have more nurses who have more discretionary authority, right? The lawyer with a JD does not want paralegals to be able to do wills after 18 months of training, right? So we have this very powerful upper middle class professional caste, and the way it's organized is you have this all-powerful professional with the sacred credential, and then all of the others have very limited rote functions in the office, whether it's the legal office, medical office, and they can't make decisions on their own. So that's part of the upgrading process. Give them more autonomy, give them more authority.
And the fact that it's the nurses' unions and the teachers' unions that tend to be the most progressive unions in the country these days, certainly the most vociferous in terms of willing to go out on strike, bring power and pressure to bear.
Yeah, and my mother was a teacher, my grandmother was a teacher. A lot of the objections the teachers have is you have political forces, the school board, you have politicians. It's to strip them of any autonomy, right? You can't come up with your own curriculum. Part of it is the fault of the educational bureaucracy itself, because a lot of the good jobs are in the central school district bureaucracy, and they justify, don't rat me out, but they justify their high incomes by coming up with here's the new district-wide curriculum, and this is what all the teachers must teach, and so, and that's kind of a synecdoche
Absolutely.
of the problem with the working class in general, and neoliberals tend to talk about class solely in money terms. Mickey Kaus has this great line, money liberalism, right? It's just some people have too much money, some people have too little, but it's also dignity.
Absolutely.
And it's power.
Power and dignity.
And it's authority within your own sphere.
Absolutely. Absolutely. We got a hand right here. Yeah, you. Speak up, speak up, speak up, speak up. We can hear your voice. You can hear.
Example of how it looks like Bernie might be doing that is how, in my country, the UK, there's a candidate called Jeremy Corbyn, who had a motto which was, for the many, not the few. Now, Bernie has repurposed that to, for the many. He's removed the not the few part. And I think that's a big mistake. And I think, every time you ask about left populism, every time a left populist of any kind, whether it's the first communist people, or Corbyn, or Trump, or even any kind of populist, even Zelensky in Ukraine, about to win this weekend, they're always against, he's not a left populist, he's populist. They've always got to be against something. And if you try to mobilize the working class without directly trying to crush and take on the elites, and that's not a key part of the message, I think you're going to really struggle. So I'd love some reactions to that.
Want to respond?
No, that's yours, my brother.
That's my view entirely. That's the difference. That's why I quoted Lincoln's advisor, Henry Carey, the harmony of interest between capital and labor. And Lincoln has this great speech. He says, we're not declaring a war on labor, but in the same speech he says labor is fundamental, it's prior to capital. So I agree with you. I think the demagogic populism, and I'm not using this as a flattering term, there's this enemy within, and then there's the virtuous many, and the single heroic demagogic figure, the tribune of the masses, the Caesarist figure, represents the many against the... This is quite different. right? So, and what I'm talking about, it is class analysis. It's not Marxist class analysis, but you need a professional class. You need a college-educated elite. You need technocrats, right? You also need, yeah.
But the difference, but let me just drop in just quickly, that when capital declares war on labor, labor has to respond. And it can't just be harmony when the war is coming at you.
Right.
You see what I mean? So the question becomes, how do you declare war on the injustice that capital is perpetrating against labor? Same would be true with patriarchy against women, white supremacy against people of color. You have to have a countervailing force, which is dealing with a battlefield. But if it's injustice, it's still cast in the form of public interest. You see what I'm saying? Would you agree with that?
I think the enemies have a face, though.
The enemies have?
I think the enemies have a face.
Yes. Yes, and a central point is that, is that it's not just demagogues who need enemies,
Right.
right? So the one who's the proponent of the structural alternative also needs enemies.
Yeah,
And
so,
he needs to be able to say, like Roosevelt, I want to be judged by the standard of who my enemies are.
but here's the difference between my view and the populist view. So in my forthcoming book, The New Class War, I say, well, how does this end? It does not end with the annihilation of the managerial class by the working class. It ends in a class peace treaty, right? It's a negotiated end to the conflict where the managerial elite is restrained by the working class, but it does its job in the collaborative national, international project of growth and human development. And the working class does its job. And it's an uneasy treaty. It's just like diplomatic treaties between rival powers, but it can break down. And if it breaks down, then you go back to the war. But that's the goal. And I distinguish this view, and I think this is a kind of a minority view, from what is being sold, by most political movements. Like a lot of socialists, well, you get rid of the class war, everyone will be a toiling proletarian, right? I went and listened to Gorbachev in New York back in the 90s, and they passed out his mimeographed CV, and he had to list his class, and it said peasant, right? I thought, okay, well, all right, we'll all be peasants. So we're not getting rid of the managerial professional elite. The neoliberal, the false promise of neoliberalism is everyone can be a doctor and lawyer and tech entrepreneur, right? And the math just doesn't work out there. So, but on the other hand, as Professor West says, when there's war from one side, the other side has to defend itself.
You got to fight back. But it's democratic accountability with thick mechanisms of answerability. That's what public life in a democracy seems to be about, though. Yes, my dear sister.
I really thought that your conversation about alternative interests was super interesting, but now in our age of very racialized political rhetoric, I get also said, how can you reconcile having collaboration versus specific goals of specific groups, and how do you ensure that some voices aren't just ignored in that broader
Right. No, I'm glad you asked that because this comes up again and again. But I want to push back on the assumption. And the assumption is that the U.S. is uniquely racially polarized in its politics. So I looked at the numbers. The white population, let's just look at Democrats and Republicans, okay? The white population is divided 54, 55, 45 between Democrats and Republicans. It's more Republican, but not by that much. It's almost half and half. Latinos and that's a broad category, but if we just use a census category, in the 2018 midterms, cast 29% of their vote for Republicans. So it's about 30-70, which is divided. I mean, there's a bigger gap, but it's divided. So to my mind, that does not show absolute stark racial polarization. There are two exceptions. And we were talking about this earlier. African Americans, 90% Democratic, like 9 or 10%. I think it's 9, I don't know what the one is. Republican. their fellow, most African Americans now, as throughout history, live in the South. It's about 57% after the last census. Base of the Democratic Party, base of the Republican Party is white Southerners who are overwhelmingly polarized against the Democrats, much more than white Midwesterners or white Northeasterners and so on. So that's a kind of legacy. But I just don't think it's the case. Outside of those two Southern majority groups, for historical reasons, I don't think our politics are all that polarized. We use the journalistic and pundit world. If a majority of Latinos votes for the Democrats, then you just equate Latinos with Democrats. But 70% is 70%. It's not 100%.
But the discourse is so polarized. You'd agree with that, though?
Oh yeah, and I think the reason for that is our electoral system, our first past the post electoral system, which we inherited from Britain. What it means is, just to be, I co-founded an organization called Fair Vote to promote proportional representation and alternative voting with Rob Ritchie and Heinrich Hertzberg of the New Yorker and Senator John Anderson, who ran for president back in 1980 against Reagan and Carter. And Fair Vote's efforts, thanks particularly to its leader, Rob Ritchie, Maine has now adapted the alternative vote for all of its state offices. It's the first state in the United States. And what an alternative vote, do you rank your classes here? When you're applying in some universities, they do that. It was ranked choice voting. So you rank the candidates in order, and if no candidate wins 50%, then the number twos are reassigned, and so on until somebody gets a majority. A first choice, second choice, third choice. In places where this has been done, and it's been adopted in Berkeley, California, and various other cities, here, Cambridge.
It's different here.
Well,
Too complicated to explain.
take it outside. Take it outside and settle it outside. But thanks. But it does change the dynamic because you'll have 3 or 4 candidates. You can cast a vote for a minority party without hurting your second choice. So if you're a Green, you're not going to take votes away from the Democrat in a 3-person election. And it has been shown in Europe and the US and Australia that it changes the tone of politics because you stand together on the stage, 3 or 4 candidates, and you say, I want you to cast your first vote for me, but if you want to vote for my friend Cornell here, then think about me as your second choice, right? And it really does change the culture as opposed to if you just get this one block of voters and it just gets you over the finish line, and then you will have 100% of the power. You just got a plurality. You didn't even have to get 50% in a 3 or 4-way race or the electoral college. And then you just use that power to annihilate your enemies, right, for the next 2 years or 4 years. So I guess I'm more optimistic. I think that our system encourages narrow casting, and it's not just race. I mean, it's religion. And the things that are the most inflammatory tend to be characteristics that cannot be changed, right? Or unlikely to be changed, race and religion, right? And so that's incredibly dangerous in a democracy because you can convert liberals and persuade them to become conservatives, but you're not going to, we're going to have conservative Christians, Muslims, liberal Hindus, people of all different religions in this country forever, and they have to coexist, right? You have to have peaceful coexistence and mutual respect. And if the parties are, trying to rile up this group against the other, it's kind of sectarian warfare or tribal warfare, that's a complete disaster for a democracy.
Integrating kind of the last few points, and especially with what you just said, I kind of want to push back against the idea that
Well, I think, and your professors can weigh in on this as well. In these sorts of movements we're talking about, like the New Deal and the Civil Rights Revolution, there are enemies. I mean, it's the people who benefit from the unjust system, okay? But,
More specifically, let me say
yeah.
something. So just take the economic element. Suppose you have what we're calling a productivist project. And then your the economy is that there are a series of groups that are rent extractors. They are extracting rents without making corresponding productive contributions. On that view, they're the enemy. And you need some dialectic which transforms that into the public conversation. Because otherwise politics becomes a pretense of good feeling without dramatic and decisive national action.
I guess maybe a different way to put it would be, how can we rally for something and not only operate that way? If we only operate that way, we get nowhere. We kind of need a
Well, I think it's the vision of what happens after you win. And you say, okay, we're going to abolish chattel slavery. It's going to be a huge hit to the planter class, but they're going to be, their rights are going to be respected. You know, they're going to be citizens. It's going to be their children and grandchildren will be part of a better society. If it's the 1930s, you know, we're going to tax wealthy people, and they're going to be losers when it comes to the, you know, the new tax system. But they will benefit by, they and their families and friends, by being part of a better, more flourishing society. It may take a generation or two. So I think you do have to have a positive vision where, and if you don't have a program where this can be done in 10 or 20 or 30 years and then there's an aftermath, then it really is demagogic, right? It's just you're going to always rail against the same group, like Mayor Curley here in Boston, as I understand it. He represented the Irish Americans against the Boston Brahmins for 50 years. Just ran against Beacon Hill, right? So, so that's the difference between kind of unprincipled demagogy and a program.
The most adorable public philosopher ever to emerge out of the United States, William James, wrote an essay before he died called The Moral Equivalent of War. The moral equivalent of war. How do you channel the martial spirit against foes that are worthy of being crushed, like poverty and white supremacy and greed? And it's inside of all of us, so it becomes internal as well as external in that sense. But you can't escape a battlefield. See, to be the kind of primates we are in space and time means you on a battlefield. And it's a temptation. And I think it's a kind of sentimental tilt. And I'm not accusing you all of sentimentalism, but it's a sentimental tilt to think that somehow you can escape battle because people are already, the masses are already being viciously attacked. They've got to come up with counterattacks. There's got to be ways in which countervailing forces, organizations, institutions, individuals, whatever it is, push back, right? But then the question becomes, what's the quality of the people who do the pushing back? See, that's the difference between a Martin King and somebody else who pushes back against white supremacy, but he's got a level of spiritual maturity, so he understands he's still got to live with these gangsters who've been trying to do into black children, and so you still got to live with these folk. And how you going to create a new society, especially when their children come along and so forth and so on. But I know we've got some other questions. Yes, go right ahead.
Awesome.
Yes. Was it awesome my point of choosing you? No, I'm just kidding. You said awesome.
This question's about your book, The Next American Nation.
Uh-huh.
We read parts of it. We didn't read chapter 4 though, which was interesting. So I was wondering, I guess my question A is to this room, which is pretty somewhat representative of Harvard College and Harvard Law School and Princeton and Yale and Stanford and so on. Chapter 4 of that book you talk about like the admissions process and composition of it, and you had a lot to say about that. And I was wondering, I guess part A to my question is, have your views changed in the 20 years since that book came out? And if so or not, in what way can you articulate your views on college admissions process and how we have dialogues within our college about it, seeing as kind of a very existential question for many people?
given that like it forms the community that they're in. And this part 2 of that question is about the same book. It also relates to our sister in the middle's question earlier about particular groups within this ideal sort of transracial class coalition, which you're going for, which is very Martin Luther King and very pro-community. That's very not cool right now in colleges. That's very, like, your answer to her question was not satisfactory to a lot of people in the room. I'm not saying like personally, but it was the discourse today, like the word colorblind is very taboo today. The idea that there's like some sort of like, shared humanity that we could get beyond the particulars. And I do agree that there's a lot of value in the current mode, which is about like diving really deep into the particularity, into like the intersection of a certain identity, into a sort of postmodern, end nub at the end of the power. I think there's a lot of value in diving into like specific, into the specific someone's identity. At the same time, I do personally believe that there's some sort of, common fire or common water or whatever you want to call it. But how do we talk about that? How do we, like, because it's not, you can't say colorblind today. And I'm not sure I would want it to be colorblind. I mean, we've been Howard Schultz, which I don't like. But how would you have that discourse today if you were in college today?
Well, you sound like an old fogey. When I was in college, the left did not focus on ritual phrases. They debated ideas, right? So, but I'll get to the major point. As for the college admission stuff, was pointing out the hypocrisy of the managerial professional class claiming to be meritocratic when you have legacy programs, that benefit their children and grandchildren. And of course, this has been in the news lately. What has changed between 1995, when I wrote The Next American Nation, and now, for example, the new book? I don't care at this point about who gets into Harvard. It seems much less important to me in 2019 than it did in 1995. As long as the home health aides and the retail clerks have agency and power and authority, all right, then I don't care, right? I mean, you can make it 80% hereditary, you can make it proportionate to groups in the population. That's the 30%, okay? So at this point, I'm more interested in raising the institutional collective power of the 70%. It's not that I would change my views, but I just think it's a less important issue. Okay, so race. I read this stuff on the left, and it's class reductionism. If you talk about transracial collaboration, or you kind of like old-fashioned Marxists, and race is all imaginary, and then you have the race consciousness. Well, I was born into an apartheid state. I mean, my in-laws' marriage was illegal until 1967. My aunt was arrested and desegregating lunch counters with her African American friends, and so this is not that long ago, right? And just like all the Nazis didn't vanish in 1945, right? The white supremacists didn't vanish. 1965, 1964. So I'm for both race-conscious and race-neutral measures. So, for example, if racial profiling is a real thing. I mean, I have many friends and acquaintances who've been through this, who are African American or Latino, and they're stopped because of the way they look by police, including sometimes African American and Latino police. It's not always white police. That is a race-specific problem that has to be dealt with by appropriate measures. It kind of faded away, but in the early part of the Black Lives Matters movement, there were some really constructive proposals for removing, in police shootings, you would remove it from the local grand jury to the state government. And for example, in New York, they proposed this. I don't know whether they did it, right, to get away from the prejudice of the local community people. But I'm interested in solutions, okay? So there's discrimination, ongoing discrimination, which exists and will always exist in some degree. and you have anti-discrimination laws, you have things like these grand jury laws, police shootings, and yeah, but you're counteracting existing racial discrimination right now in 2019. Then there is the historic legacy of 400 years of colonialism and white supremacy and segregation and slavery. And if you can find, I'm open to race-specific measures to address this, and in terms of reparations and apologies, as Professor West knows, the Bible forbids inherited guilt, right? You shall not set the teeth of your children on edge, the guilty person. The children will not be punished, but corporations, including the United States of America, the Harvard Corporation, are collective individuals and they can be held accountable, right? As institutions, right? So I'm fine with that. What I find puzzling about these people attacking transracial or race-neutral policies, that's what I call it, race-neutral, colorblind, race-neutral, is that these are areas where, if it's wage laws, if it's benefits, if it's lack of housing opportunities, it just makes no sense logistically or bureaucratically to kind of try to do this on a racial or ethnic basis, right? I mean, are you going to have different minimum wages for different ethnic groups? That just, it doesn't make sense to me, right? If you're going to strengthen union laws, that will help everybody out, right, of that class, right? So I don't think it's either or. I think it's both and. Now I realize this is, politically incorrect in some circles, but I'm not giving you the class reductionist that's only class, that race is not part of it. And I'll tell you, as being a high immigration society, many immigrants bring with them stereotypes from their home countries about African Americans and others. Sure. So this is a perpetual thing to deal with, and we just have to deal with it by the appropriate responses.
I absolutely agree. That's an and question between the class race, between harmony of interest and interest. I guess the one thing I disagree with is I think it is super important that for like 30 whatever years or more, 65% of my Harvard class comes from the top 15% of income in the United States. I think that matters a lot, especially as we go off the world, start running the world, and start deciding who gets power, who doesn't.
See, I don't want you students here to run the world.
But his objection is that they do.
I know. I went to an Ivy League school too. I don't want to run the world.
You got that Yale connection.
Yeah. So no, but that was my point. Yeah. I do not believe. Now I do believe in that virtual representation does make sense, right? That is, if you have a completely homogeneous elite, they're simply not going to. They're going to ignore the concerns of people. Okay?
Yeah.
But I think the main problem this country faces now is not that we don't have a sufficiently diverse oligarchy. It's that the non-oligarchy of all backgrounds needs more power relative to the oligarchy.
Let's give it up for our dear brother Michael.
Thank you.
I'm telling you, man, that was
So Cornell, next week is our last class. Please come with general comments and questions, pervasive themes in the argument of the courts. That was great, Mike.
Thank you. It's a good student.
No, it's true. That's very
Self-selected.
but brother, anytime you can come back, any help we can be, and any support we can be.
presentation. Are you in Austin? Okay.
Yeah.
Well, we'll be there soon. We're moving back. We moved. Yeah, we first went to school here. Yeah, we moved. We lived there